I'm about to introduce our last speaker for the day, Professor Susan Schell. She chairs the Political Science Department at Boston College. She has a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and her PhD in political sciences from Harvard. She's taught at Harvard, at Brock University, at McMaster University, Concordia University. I may have missed some in there. She is a specialist on Immanuel Kant. So we're about to take a step into a sort of higher, more academic level of discourse here, as we put it. Kant is a key figure in our idea of world citizenship, one of the most important philosophers in Western history, with a focus on the universality of reason and rights, things like that. I'll let Susan unpack that for you. To understand world citizenship, the ideas that flow out of that, certainly requires touching base with Immanuel Kant. I'm very pleased to welcome Susan.
I guess I'm one of these dreaded specialists. And you know that for sure, having read the handout, which I kind of whipped up last night between flurries of snow. So I apologize for its less than polished look. And before getting started, I would just like to make maybe a few comments. One biographical. I've been going to school since kindergarten, and my whole life I've been teaching at Boston College for over 3 decades. I've taught at other schools as well. I think I've taught in a total of 9 different universities in Canada and the U.S. My husband's an academic. I've looked over his shoulder and seen his adventures in the land of literature, academic literature, and I really come at this as a dedicated faculty member and chair of my department for 10 years, who was also devoted to her discipline. And I must say that responding to really horrific figures that we just learned about civic education and the lack thereof in many of today's colleges and universities, I would just want to offer a bit of an alternative point of view. My department, which is by no means doctrinaire politically on one or other side of the spectrum, has been battling for a number of years to have American politics and civic education included as part of the core curriculum at Boston College. And it's really been an uphill and I think losing battle. Against whom? Against administrators who have their own, not always enlightened ideas, and certain favored programs which I think aren't so much running the show as sometimes being used by administrators to accumulate power of their own against the faculty who really ought to be setting the curriculum. And so I would say, please don't give up entirely on the faculty. I mean, there are an awful lot of well-educated and well-meaning faculty out there who are disempowered by administrators. One of the reasons why I think this creeping ideological morass or fog bank has taken over so readily is not so much that there's a dedicated cohort of rabid faculty members with their own agenda, though there are certainly some of those, but that it becomes a very easy way for administrators to manage universities. And as administrators and even college presidents have less and less contact with liberal education, many of them are coming out of business schools now or other venues, they don't really know in their guts, the way I think many of us do, what a liberal education can do for a young person. I dare say that most, if not all, of the people in this room have had that visceral encounter with a great teacher or a terrific program at some point in their educational career. And so I would say it's a terribly complex problem, and I applaud very much the efforts to bring trustees and parents and alumni into the equation. But please don't give up on the faculty. That would be my personal plea. I'd also like to say that I came here today with the intention and in the spirit of the initial title of at least of the invitation to this conference, which was resuming the conversation. And so my remarks are intended really as an attempt to reach out to members of the Bowdoin faculty as fellow scholars. I don't have any great knowledge of Bowdoin College myself or of the issues surrounding recent conflicts. So rather than talk about what I don't know very much about, I would like to speak a little bit more broadly. If my remarks seem unduly ecumenical, I apologize, but I do hope that when you converse, you have to converse with an interlocutor, and I hope there's someone there to answer back. So with those words, I'll start. The title of my remarks today is World Citizenship and Higher Education, the Misunderstood Case of Immanuel Kant. And today, global education, I think, tends to have a double face. On the one hand, it's often touted as a prudent preparation for the economic challenges of a so-called global marketplace, that is, finding a job. On the other, it's presented as a kind of ethical, overriding ethical imperative that no decent person should ignore. I'd like to focus today on the latter aspect of global education, without entirely forgetting its other harder-nosed face. I think one reason why one hears about it so much, especially from college presidents, especially when they're addressing would-be students and their parents. The notion that a well-educated person should know something about foreign lands is, of course, nothing new. Americans who could afford it have long sent their children abroad, as with 19th century continental tours and the like. And cosmopolitanism, or world citizenship, broadly understood, has a long and distinguished intellectual career. Along with Diogenes, it also, and somewhat more respectably, is associated with, say, the Stoics, with Cicero, even with Augustine, not to mention Erasmus, Grotius, Pufendorf, and other members of the modern natural rights tradition. Indeed, if cosmopolitanism is defined as the conviction that human beings have certain rights and obligations by virtue of their humanity, just by sheer fact of being human, there are probably few, if any, persons in this room or in any liberal democratic audience who would deny being cosmopolitans. Certainly the authors of the Declaration of Independence, who invoke both the self-evidence of certain inalienable human rights and the need for a decent regard for the opinions of mankind, would be included in such company. Still, there is undoubtedly something new about the way global citizenship is typically invoked today. And we've seen a number of particularly egregious examples in earlier talks. And here the comments, I think, both his current president may be instructive, although I don't think they differ all that much in their tenor from those one might hear from Drew Faust at Harvard or from my own dean at Boston College. To quote President Mills, in the recent and much quoted opening address to students, and here I refer you to the handout, the first quotation, he says, Martha Nussbaum from the University of Chicago recently has written, today Martha Nussbaum comes up a lot, and I will continue that practice. Quote, all modern democracies are societies in which the meaning and ultimate goals of human life are topics of reasonable disagreement among the citizens who hold many different religious and secular views. And these citizens will naturally differ about how far various types of humanistic education serve their particular goals. What we can agree about is that
Young people all over the world, in any nation, lucky enough to be democratic, need to grow up to be participants in a form of government in which the people inform themselves about the crucial issues they will address as voters, and sometimes as elected or appointed officials. Now, there's nothing much to disagree with there so far, I think. Newsbound, however, goes on and says that cultivated capacities for critical thinking and reflection are crucial in keeping democracies alive and wide awake. The ability to think well about a wide range of cultures, groups, and nations in the context of a grasp of the global economy and of the history of many national and group interactions is crucial in order to enable democracies to deal responsibly with the problems we currently face as members of an interdependent world. Again, this is still President Bill quoting Martha Nussbaum. And we begin to see the veering towards something like the post-national vision that was evoked by earlier speakers. And the ability to imagine the experience of another, a capacity almost all human beings possess in some form, needs to be greatly enhanced. And we find if we are to have any hope of sustaining decent institutions across the many divisions that any modern society contains. So the idea is that to be a good citizen of a democracy, you have to cultivate the ability to see things from the viewpoint of the other. And indeed, that's a crucial, quintessential, foundational preparation for citizenship, particularly in an interdependent world. Now, neither Mill's nor Nussbaum's remarks here specifically invoke the idea of global citizenship. They are explicitly concerned, rather, with democracies in the plural. Yet several undercurrents are also, I think, evident, including both the transnational responsibilities of these democracies and the dependence of critical thinking, as it's phrased, on a certain knowledge of the other as other. These themes are indeed taken up at much greater length in Nussbaum's influential earlier essay called Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism. And it was so influential, it has been, that I think it may be worth lingering over for a moment, because I think it begins to flesh out some of the philosophic or intellectual underpinnings for the views that we've been seeing rise again and again, with a view to be able to get a handle on, perhaps begin to see where there's firm and where the position might be wobbly. It also may be worth lingering over for its telling indication of the authority of Immanuel Kant, to whom I would like to turn in a few minutes. Now, continuing from the handout, quoting Martha Nussbaum, as students here grow up, Nussbaum asks, is it sufficient for them to learn that they are above all citizens of the United States, but that they all respect basic human rights of others? Or should they, as Nussbaum thinks, in addition to giving special attention to the history and current situation of the nation, which she allows, learn a good deal more than is frequently the case about the rest of the world in which they live? Should they learn, for example, only that citizens in India have equal basic human rights? Or should they also learn about the problem of hunger and pollution in India and the implications of these problems for larger problems of global hunger and global ecology? Nussbaum thinks that is the case. Most important, should they be taught that they are above all citizens of the United States? Or should they instead be taught that they are above all citizens of the world of human beings? And Nussbaum proceeds to offer in this seminal essay four arguments for why the latter conception, not that we're citizens of the United States first, but rather citizens of the world, for what she calls, which she dubs cosmopolitanism. She means cosmopolitanism. And these are the four reasons that she gives to support it. First, that by looking at ourselves through the lens of the other, as she puts it, we learn more about ourselves by coming to see what is in our practices local and contingent and what is widely shared. First, self-knowledge by looking at yourself through the eyes of the other.
Second, we make headway solving problems that require international cooperation, ecological disasters, and so on. Preeminently. Third, we recognize moral obligations to the rest of the world that are real and that otherwise would go unrecognized. For example, sustainability, and so on. And fourth, we make a consistent and coherent argument based on distinctions that are really prepared to defend. All ethnic, national, religious, and similar distinctions being, in the final analysis, arbitrary. What's real is that we are all fellow human beings. What's, in the last analysis, arbitrary is that we are defined by some identity such as nation, class, gender, and so on. And here I think she actually takes issue with people like George who emphasize identity politics. She really opposes identity politics to cosmopolitan education in the true sense. So there are differences of opinion among people who are might be roughly termed cosmopolitan in this sense. I'd like to dwell a little bit on the third argument she gives in favor of cosmopolitan education. She says, if we take Kantian morality at all seriously, as we should, we need to educate our children to be troubled by the fact that our high standard of living, for example, cannot be universalized without courting ecological disaster. So that is Mark Nussbaum's rendition of these implications of Kantian ethics. To be sure, as she then adds, politics as in child care. Cosmopolitanism does not mean that one, quote, may not permissibly give one's own sphere a special degree of concern. But the reason one can favor one's own children over others, or one's own country over others, is precisely that if the job will be done poorly, if everybody thinks they're equally responsible for all. So the reason why we should have permission at least to be particularly concerned with our own country or our own children, as opposed to children at large, or humanity at large, is precisely that it will, unless we do that, everybody will suffer. In other words, the only coherent justification for such special treatment, be it of members of our family or country, is, I think tellingly, the universalist one for Nussbaum, that everyone must be better cared for. Not that we have specific self-standing obligations to our own children, family, or to fellow citizens as fellow citizens. Okay, so continuing a bit, Nussbaum's argument. Now, that Kant's authority is so often invoked by Nussbaum and other current champions of world citizenship, I think makes it worth looking back to Kant directly, not only to his undisputed philosophical preeminence, but also owing to, and this is a little bit more controversial, his pivotal role in shaping higher education in America, perhaps especially as we now know it, a point to which I will return. Now moving on to Kant, Nussbaum to Kant. Kant has at least two ways of speaking about world citizenship. Sometimes he speaks of it as a political or legal imperative, and sometimes as a moral or pragmatic attitude. And beginning with the first, the explicit right of a world citizen, the right we all have to things according to Kant, in a legal, political, and quasi-legal sense. When we actually turn to see what he says in works such as, say, Perpetual Peace, the demands of world citizenship are actually quite modest. Here again, I refer you to the handout. Kant says that the sole political or legal right we have, ought to have, as citizens of the world, as distinguished from the rights we have as citizens of specific countries, is as follows. The right not to be treated as an enemy on one's arrival as an alien in a foreign country. so long as one behaves peacefully. This includes, for example, the right to visit temporarily, to offer to engage in commerce, an offer that may be refused by one's host, and a right to remain without, however, necessarily being able to settle until one can leave without immediate danger. That's it. Those are the rights, the quasi-legal, political rights of world citizenship as Kant understands it. And this is a right of world citizenship because it doesn't depend on specific treaties, but arises from our shared placement on the earth. And it's an obvious forerunner of current views about the rights of refugees, or say, of boat people, not to be cast back out to sea in lead vessels, but allowed to camp on at least on the beach until they can be given some kind of safe passage. So that's it. That's Kant's legal conception of the rights of a world citizen, other rights as world citizens. Otherwise, his position on the rights of sovereign nations are, perhaps surprisingly, probably as strong, if not stronger, than most people in this room today, including, if I speak for him, John Forte, and other fellow panelists. The fundamental reason for the modesty of cosmopolitan right on Kant's account, and for the concomitant strength principles of national sovereignty, is that states represent, for him, at least ideally or in principle, the express views of citizens who vote or can otherwise be regarded as self-governing. Similarly, the primary source of our special rights and obligations vis-a-vis fellow citizens is that we share a grounding and common legal framework to which we ourselves have consented as a race, we the people. Accordingly, for Kant, patriotism is not primarily an affective or emotional bond rooted in a shared history or cultural traditions and the like, although that matters to some degree. And as an aside, this is what patriotism seems to mean, by way of contrast for people like Nussbaum and Rorty. Patriotism for Kant is rather a political phenomenon, born of joint allegiance to a shared legal constitution. To interfere with the internal affairs of any state is thus in principle to violate the rights of its own citizens to be governed only by laws to which they have themselves consented, rather than by the enlightened lights of globe-hopping intellectuals. So that's his primary reason for his very strong endorsement of sovereignty rights. But at the same time, Kant's rather honest understanding of cosmopolitan right in a kind of legal sense, quasi-legal sense, is supplemented, I must be said, by emphatic advocacy on his part of a certain cosmopolitan attitude. And that attitude is highlighted in his famous little essay, which some of you may have read in college, Idea for Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View. It also serves as the capstone of his course on anthropology. Of course, he introduced Germany and taught over the course of some 40 years. Now, to be a cosmopolitan or citizen of the world in this broader attitudinal sense means, according to Kant, to strive toward a free and lawful condition that ultimately embraces the entire human race. To spread democracy, if you like, while acknowledging that this ideal can only be progressively approached but never fully actualized. And it never means or takes away from one's primary responsibility for Kant to cultivate liberal democratic practices in one's own country. So there's much more to be said than I have time to say about cosmopolitanism and Kant, but let me just say for the time being that these facts about Kant's actual cosmopolitan views might have limited, and probably do have limited appeal, other than to specialists, but for their crucial role in shaping, among other things, higher education in America as we now know it. And this is a big claim. and somewhat idiosyncratic on my part, I have to admit. And I can't, in the time remaining, fully explain it, let alone defend it. But I would like, in the time remaining, to pause to highlight two important themes. And first, and glancingly, I just would like to note that Kant's remaking of the humanities, we think of the humanities as something that's always been the same, and in some deep sense, maybe that's true. But in the 18th century, the humanities referred explicitly and exclusively to the study of Greek and Latin texts, literary and rhetorical texts. And Kant had a hand in reshaping our idea of the humanities as something, for example, that would include modern literature and modern national literatures and history and modern history, not just classical history. And that was obviously a very big step, which we now take for granted, but which was by no means a necessary or obvious development. And he also, I think, had a hand in our current understanding of the university, the modern national university, as an institution that combines both the advancement of knowledge and the formation and civic formation, and specifically the formation of liberal democratic citizens imbued with a particular national culture. Because in the 18th century, again, this was by no means the case. Knowledge was advanced in academies. The university was for the transmission of what everybody already knew. And Kant had a singular hand in reshaping the university as we now know it, which has these dual roles, which I think are borne out even in the description of the land-grant colleges that was passed out earlier today. This rather unique from the point of view of what universities had been for hundreds of years, this unique double charge, which don't always sit so easily together, of promoting the advancement of knowledge on the one hand and promoting civic education on the other. So I just say that in passing. In passing. But second, and here's the second Kantian kind of contribution for good or ill to higher education I'd also like to mention. That is his celebration, if not invention, of the notion of critical thinking. And here I found Herb London's remarks just extremely helpful. Because we all now kind of take for granted, yes, critical thinking is a good thing, and that's what liberal education is all about. Ultimately teaching us to be critical thinkers. And I think both the authors of the NAS report and those whom they might wish to respond on the Bowdoin side, I think would praise critical thinking, while of course accusing the other side of shutting it down. But what is this critical thinking? No one prior to Kant had much to say in favor of criticism per se. Critique, from the Greek kritain, to judge, mainly referred in Kant's time to art criticism. The criticism referred to looking at paintings and deciding, whether they were any good or not. And Kant elevated criticism to a term designating both the essence of philosophy in its kind of crucial foundational sense, and the highest task of education. So what did he mean by criticism? Criticism is that whereby people, men, women, man, both individually and collectively emerges from what Kant calls a self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity where we simply take on faith, passively receive the wisdom from other people, and sort of internalize it and make it our own. An immaturity that tempts all of us, according to Kant, to rely on external authority in life's most pressing matters, rather than having the courage, as he puts it, to be wise, that is, to think for ourselves. Now, liberal education is mainly the job, or was, as he saw it, mainly the job of his own faculty, his own department, the most important department, of course, the faculty of philosophy, a faculty that in his time was roughly equivalent to what we now call colleges or schools of arts and sciences. So liberal education for Kant essentially means, he says, learning to philosophize. And here I think you will begin to see the seeds of many of the aspects of the modern notion of liberal education. Its emphasis on the individual, its emphasis on individual choice, it's in the individual of not simply receiving wisdom transmitted, but somehow making it fresh for yourself, that didn't come out of nowhere. Philosophizing, Kant says, cannot be taught through imitation. So this is contrary in a way to the classical view of liberal education. Philosophizing cannot be taught by imitation or through the memorization, the memorized accumulation of information. That may be needed, but that's not the heart of the matter. And here I'll quote directly from the Critique of Pure Reason. This is what he says about what genuine education that kind of entails. He says, however knowledge may originally be given, it is still for him who possesses it merely historical, if he knows it only at the level and as much as has been given to him from outside, whether through immediate experience or narration, or even instruction of general knowledge. He who has, in the strict sense, learned a system of philosophy knows and judges only what has been given to him. He has formed himself according to a foreign reason. But the imitative faculty is not the productive one. That is, knowledge has not arisen in him out of reason. And although objectively it may be rational knowledge, subjectively it is merely historical. He has grasped and retained, that is, learned, in the sense of learned by heart, and is a plaster cast on which the shape of a living man has been imposed. Not good. Knowledge that is rational objectively, then, is so subjectively, really internally, only when derived from, quote, sources from which there can also arise the criticism and rejection of what is learned, and hence only when at home in and able to withstand what Kant calls conflict. But Kant then asks rhetorically, again referring to the handout, but must not, at least the young who are entrusted to academic instruction, be preserved from a premature knowledge of such dangerous skeptical propositions, doubts about the verities, love of country, love of God, and so on, until the teaching one would ground them in is so rooted as to withstand all opposition. Kant's answer, nothing would be emptier or more fruitless than to keep youthful reason under temporary tutelage, by exposing them only to salutary dogma. To do so is only to provoke the rebellion of youth, who believes he can no way better show he has outgrown childish discipline than by throwing dogma aside, only to embrace the toxic counter-dogma of an ungrounded skepticism. Critical thinking, in other words, for Kant, is not something, it requires conflict, seeing opposing sides. But it's not learned by or internalized by simply standing neutrally aside, turning on Fox News and then listening to NPR. That will not accomplish what is required. Watching dogmatists and skeptics, who are themselves no less dogmatic, exchange blow for blow. Hence, it does not arise from your exposure to opposing views. That is, with apologies to some of my fellow speakers, to diversity, intellectual or otherwise. In describing the thoughts of an imagined student, Kant also portrays the contours that he sees of man's generic adolescence, the adventurous and self-reliant reason that in mistaking discipline for servitude jeopardizes its own self-grounded development. Let's see, how are we doing for time? What? Are we okay? Okay, I'll be done. Speculative reason, he goes on to say on the handout, is transcendental is, in its transcendental use, is dialectical in itself. The objections that are to be feared lie in ourselves. We must search them out like old but never superannuated claims in order to ground eternal peace on their annihilation. Devise, therefore, objections yourself that have not yet occurred to any opponent. Criticize for the sake of criticism, and even lend him the weapons or concede him the most favorable position he could wish. There is nothing in this to fear, but rather much to hope. Namely, that you will come into a possession that in all future will never more be disturbed. Now, what Kant has in mind in these very difficult sections is roughly, I think, the following. An unenlightened human mind is buffeted between two opposing points of view in the matter that most deeply concerns us as human beings. According to one dogmatic point of view, man is free and answerable to God, rewarding and punishing God. According to the other, there is no God, and man is nothing more than a clever animal, an accumulation of matter and motion. And according to Kant, it's only by tracing both of these positions back to a common root illusion, the mistaken assumption that we can know, as he puts it, things in themselves, can we begin to tap the true source of human wisdom, which for Kant is the pure self-legislating activity of human reason itself, practically or morally directed. That is to say, autonomy in the particularly demanding Kantian sense. Now, the upshot of what is admittedly an extremely demanding argument that I can't do justice to and that scholars continue to struggle with is a well-grounded conviction, and this is the point I would like to emphasize, is a well-grounded conviction, as Kant sees it, that the interests of reason and the requirements of republican, liberal democratic civic life, of roughly the sort we currently enjoy, are fundamentally at harmony. That if you let reason rip and really get to the bottom of it, and that means criticizing its own ability, drawing limits to what it can know and what it can't, that you're sort of guaranteed that the upshot will be a happy outcome for liberal democratic values. That's Kant's, ultimate view of the matter. And we contemporary academics, as it seems to me, have often rested on that comforting conviction without always fully probing its foundation. Accordingly, whether we call ourselves liberals or conservatives, we imagine that by teaching our students to think critically, to question entrenched opinion, whatever it may be, we have fulfilled what is arguably our main task as educators, namely to help form good citizens who are also good human beings. Now, I could hardly urge all of you to take up the serious study of Kant, which would bear witness to a prejudice on my part of the most egregious sort. But in reflecting on the culture wars that have buffeted higher education in recent years, I wonder if both sides do not reflect a partial and, begging your indulgence, somewhat decayed version of Kantianism. On the one side, the Nussbaumians and their like, who ignore the peculiar importance of actual self-government for any genuinely Kantian view of citizenship, including world citizenship, and who treat diversity, or seeing oneself through the lens of the other, as an adequate vehicle of critical self-knowledge. But on the other side, and here's the offer to continue the conversation, and I think the other side, which may in some measure be represented by certain arguments even within the NAS report, a perhaps too easy assimilation of civic virtue with the demands of the free market, as if economic cosmopolitanism, taken to an extreme, did not pose as much of a threat to a decent civic life as does exaggerated environmentalist alarm. Similarly, I wonder if the authors of the report do not err in seeking to combat the diversity movement homeopathically, that is, by demanding more diversity, as in hire more conservatives. Now, these gentle criticisms will, I trust, be received in good humor and with a view to finding common ground, or in the generous and gracious words of Peter Wood and the other organizers of this conference, resuming a conversation. Thank you.